some bread. Today we're going to be talking about birth trauma, and although this can be extremely triggering for some people, it's very, very important to discuss. Trauma can be a matter of perception, and in fact, 1 in 3 women do express that they've experienced some trauma, whether it be in their birth or in their lives before the birth even happened. Helplessness can in fact be a defining factor as to what triggers all of this. If you've had a traumatic birth experience, this doesn't have to be extreme, okay? So you might be listening to this video and you might be thinking like, well, I didn't have a traumatic birth, I didn't really see any issues with my birth, but I'm still feeling this unsettled feeling and I don't really quite understand why. There has been different studies done where women have been interviewed and they have expressed what their common themes were with what they were hoping to achieve and what they actually received, which led them to having the traumatic birth experience that they had. One of the themes were that they just wanted to be cared for, and they were questioning, is that too much to ask? They just wanted to be cared for by their providers and by the nursing staff or by their midwives, and instead they were left feeling abandoned, alone, stripped of their dignity, and in some cases they even felt like they were raped. This is something that's happened to people. Another common theme was they just wanted to be communicated with, and they felt that they were neglected. So they felt that a lot of doctors and clinicians were talking to each other and they weren't actually involved in the decision making. This is stripping your decision making away from yourself, which gives you that loss of control feeling. And then it just feels like as if they weren't even in the room and the experience was happening more to them as opposed to being involved in the experience. Another theme was that they wanted safe care to be provided for them, and they felt like their trust had been betrayed. They felt powerless. They started out feeling extremely confident, and then that dwindled down to feeling like nothing. They didn't feel like they were important anymore. They didn't feel like they were being listened to. Another theme is that a lot of people were feeling that a lot of clinicians were saying that the ends would justify the means, but at what price? So a lot of the times clinicians would justify an induction that brought on a lot of interventions that were not originally wanted by the families. If they're not medically necessary, then it's something that's kind of coerced into a situation. And if ever there's a situation like this where you're feeling very stripped of your original ideas and you're feeling like you're not being listened to, and if you're feeling like you're not mattering, like these are all things that can trigger a traumatic birth experience. So some instances of what people have expressed that they've experienced when they were having a traumatic birth was not being listened to, caregivers that are shouting, physically being held down, being belittled or mocked for their choices or what their care plan was, what they were hoping for. They were feeling that the procedures were extremely invasive with lacking of communication. They did not engage clients in decision making, coerced to consent, and threats of legal action. While I've been studying the effects of trauma in the birth experience, I've come to realize that I do feel that it is a lot more common than not that postpartum depression, this is something that moms are often diagnosed with because they say that the hormonal shifts, they're feeling very low, they're sometimes having like just these intrusive thoughts, they're feeling more like they have negative thoughts, they have change in function capacity, they're just not feeling like themselves. And often when they go to their care provider and they say, I'm feeling this way, I feel a disconnect with my baby, I'm not feeling like myself, I don't feel a connection with my spouse, automatically you're diagnosed with postpartum depression without even a conversation in most cases of how did your birth experience go. The reason I'm bringing this up and why I'm bringing it into your attention is because if you consider all of the different things that can happen in a birth that can affect you emotionally, that can affect you physically, that can affect you spiritually, that can just affect you in all of these ways that are now creating and molding you into this parent. If you are coming into parenthood with any doubt or any guilt or any of those negative feelings because of outside factors that happened to you during your birth that you can't even quite put into words yet, these are going to give you these thoughts. You're going to have those intrusive memories. You're going to have the avoidance. You're going to just completely feel different. You're not going to feel like yourself. You're going to feel like you failed to some capacity. And this is not you. This is the experience that happened to you, and you're triggering a trauma response by having these symptoms and having these feelings. And when you bring them up to your care provider and without a proper conversation that happens, then often what will happen is you'll be diagnosed with postpartum depression when in fact you could be experiencing post-traumatic stress. So it's important to note that with birth trauma, it's not just about the birth, but also about the absence of support and understanding. So what we're wanting to do is bringing attention to the potential causes of birth trauma. Like this can be anything and everything. And this isn't to scare you, because birth is meant to be an empowering process, which is why I think it's so important to bring attention to what trauma looks like in a birth experience, because I think a lot of people are closing their eyes to them. They think that just because I've had a healthy baby and because I'm healthy that you're okay, but there might be healing that needs to be done before having the next baby, or with continuing on with your life with parenthood, just to build that confidence in yourself and just to be overall much healthier emotionally and spiritually and all of that. So potential causes of birth trauma that you probably be aware of would be like C-section, excessive hemorrhaging, any type of assisted birth with like the vacuum or the forceps, if your baby had to go in the NICU, if you delivered a stillbirth, if you're having any placenta issues, if you developed preeclampsia, any type of medical complications like HELP, if you're feeling violated from the OB, if you're experiencing any type of medical neglect, if you're feeling midwifery violence, like these are all things that you'd be like, obviously this was a traumatic experience for me. I can tell because it's just obvious. But some things that you might not realize that can also trigger a traumatic response, the way that your brain and your mind are connecting, would be lack of support, loss of control, lack of consent. With everything that's been going on in the last 2 years, maybe your partner wasn't allowed to be with you and you felt completely alone being there. You had lack of communication, loss of that golden hour when your baby's born and baby is on your chest. If that whole situation was rushed and you didn't get that bonding experience, that might be something that your mind and your body would just kind of connect as like, that was quite traumatic for me because that was something that was extremely important. There was no reason that I couldn't have it, and I didn't speak up, and so that's one of those things that could happen as well. Or just previous trauma. So another important thing to mention then is that trauma is still valid, even if you never shared your story, if you've never felt comfortable enough to talk to anybody about it and you've just been in silence feeling this way. Your trauma is still valid. If you've never realized that it was trauma until much later, if you have been spending time reflecting, and the more you reflect, the more upset you're feeling, and that is fine. It's still validated. You still have trauma. Even if it happened a long time ago, even if it was not a near-death experience, it doesn't have to be a huge trauma that is viewed by somebody else. If somebody else's trauma looks a lot different than yours, that is fine. If you feel that you've had trauma, then you've had trauma. It's all a matter of how your perception, and it is from yourself and how you're feeling, because nobody else can feel your feelings but you. If others have had it worse, it doesn't matter. You still have had your own trauma. And even if you feel better now, but you're able to look back at an experience that you've had, birth or not, if you're able to look back at a previous experience and you're looking at it and you're thinking to yourself, wow, that really shaped me and changed me as a person, and that really put me through some of my darkest times. I have gotten better since then. But you can look back at that without shame to be able to say, I experienced a traumatic experience. I'm seeing these characteristics in myself and how it shaped and shifted the person that I was to who I am now. And that's okay too. That's all still validated. Things that you can do for yourself though, if you have experienced trauma in your birth or in any previous experience and you're wanting to try to make a couple steps to healing from it, is the first thing is not to judge yourself. Easier said than done. Don't judge yourself. So this is going to be a healing journey of acceptance. This is going to be where you are going to be gentle with yourself. You're going to seek practical support if you need it. So if you're finding that emotionally, if it's after birth, theoretically, you're just not feeling up to the tasks of like whatever it is that you really feel is important to be doing. Like if you can't take care of the house and the baby, or if you're feeling stressed because you're incapable of keeping up with certain chores or are feeling obligated to do certain things, then seek out that practical support to kind of like take away that pressure for yourself. Seek out emotional support as well. So if you're feeling comfortable with somebody, find that special person, if it's your spouse, if it's a parent, if it's a sibling, if it's a best friend, and confide in them and trust them with your emotions so that you have a safe soundboard that you can express yourself with, so that you're not going through this by yourself anymore. Acknowledge the feelings that you have, and acknowledge the ones that you're having towards yourself, your baby, and your spouse, because all of those feelings are validated. If you're feeling frustrated with anybody, if you're feeling upset with anybody, if you're feeling super happy with one but not the other, just acknowledge the feelings that you're having and allow yourself to see it from like an outsider's perspective. So again, making sure that you're talking to someone. If you can, try to obtain details, because sometimes what happens when you're having an experience and you're going through a birth and it's going very, very quickly, you have a distorted view of what actually happened. So being able to obtain your records to like look through it with somebody, maybe if it's your care provider, if you trust them, and kind of go through step by step with why things happened the way they did, so that you can understand what happened if it went too quickly for your brain and your mind to connect and understand what was going on. Important to not blame yourself. If you have reviewed everything and you've looked at it and you've discussed it with people, and even if you didn't need to do any of those things, if you feel that you've been violated in any way by a medical professional, then absolutely make a formal complaint. You can make it anonymously if you need to, but it's important that you do so anyways to help prevent similar things from happening to other people as well in the future. Important, again, give yourself time and be gentle with yourself. Healing has to start with acceptance. There's obviously so much more that I could talk about when it comes to birth trauma and healing coping mechanisms and all of these things, but this is just a little snippet that I wanted to put together. If you are interested in learning more, then make sure that you check out my website. The link will be in my bio, and check out my coaching packages.